Hello and welcome to the Revision podcast on Thatcher, Monetarism and her early economic policy. So what were her beliefs economically? Well, she believed in a free market. She thought making inflation and reducing that should be a priority, and using monetarism to do this, which would reduce and control inflation by reducing and controlling the money supply. And from that, all the other issues, economic issues, will then resolve themselves, i.e. unemployment and productivity. She also believed, as in other areas, that she should take the government off the backs of the people. So when did monetarism start? Well, in the 1950s, Friedman and von Hayek had come up with a theory, and the robot proposals by Rab Butler that were rejected by Churchill were a type of monetarism. You could say that the salesman man policies by Heath leaned towards monetarism, and Callaghan had also started rejecting Keynesianism and looking towards monetarist theories. Thatcher wasn't even the first one in the Conservative Party to propose monetarism. It was Keith Joseph who was her political guru, according to John O'Farrell, and it was he who persuaded her of the merits of monetarism. So when she was in power in 1979, what did she do? Well, she appointed Geoffrey Howe, and from his first budget in 1979, he set out to reduce government spending and to cut the high levels of taxation from Labour's outgoing government. This would reduce the amount of money in the system and is therefore monetarism. This budget was more radical than expected by financial experts, say Selden and Collins. In 1981, the arch-monetarist Alan Walters was appointed to her staff. And almost immediately when she came to power, she increased VAT, the indirect tax, from 8% to 12.5%, which later went up to 15%. This is because Thatcher believed that people should not be taxed on their homes or property, and it also allowed her to cut taxes elsewhere. Like she cut income tax to stimulate the private sector. Geoffrey Howe believed only such a radical switch from direct to indirect taxation could happen only soon after a general election when the mandate remained fresh. The government used a measurement of money called Sterling M3 so that they could control the amount of money in the system and know how much money was in the system. They kept interest rates high to deter borrowing and keep the pound strong. They made cuts in housing and education and overseas aid, but not the police or the army. They got money in from elsewhere. BAE and BP were privatised early on, and council houses, the right to buy, started in 1980. She wasn't ready yet to take on the unions and gave in to the miners in 1981 because the government weren't ready for confrontation at that point. For example, they hadn't got enough coal stockpiled. In the budget of 1981, monetarism was stringently applied, aiming to eliminate inflation by controlling the money supply, i.e. taxes on petrol, tobacco and alcohol went up, government borrowing went down, and local council grants were cut. So what effects did her early economic policy and monetarism have? Well, the benefits were that inflation eventually reduced to 10% by 1982 and 4% by 1983 from the 27% of the 70s. And there were signs of economic recovery in 1982-83. The negatives, though, is it made the recession that Britain was already in even worse. British goods were now more expensive on foreign markets, and that led to poor sales abroad. Therefore, there were a lot of manufacturing closures. And this is a regional bias, that there were more in the North Midlands, Wales and Scotland than there were in the South, so it widened the North-South divide. It's also been called the deindustrialisation of Britain. Unemployment went up. There's 3 million unemployed by 1982. It also had social implications in the riots in Brixton, Moss Side and Toxteth. The cuts made Thatcher's opinion, or all of this made Thatcher's opinion poll ratings go down to 27%, and it put the Conservatives in third place behind the newly formed SDP and Labour. Who was for and against monetarism then? Well, the Dries are the ones that were for it. That was Howe, Nigel Lawson, Keith Joseph, obviously. The Wets were named as the ones that were against it, and that was Nicholas Soames, Jim Pryor, Edward Heath and Ian Gilmore, all in the Conservative Party. Obviously Labour were also against it, as were the SDP. Economists were also against it. 364 of them wrote in a letter to the Times calling it brutal and for the monetarist experiment to be abandoned. So it left Britain in a deep recession, but what did Thatcher do? She carried on going, hence the ladies not for turning speech. She carried on the cuts and reducing money in the system. However, it wasn't just monetarism that affected the economy in the early 1980s. Wage settlements in the public sector that the Conservatives had agreed to honour in the election campaign in 1979 pushed inflation up initially. There's outside influences. For example, the oil price rise after a revolution in Iran pushed other prices up as well as oil. North Sea oil, though, was bringing in some money for Britain, and the government under Thatcher started to try and reduce some of the union powers in the employment acts, like the one in 1982. And there were some strikes, but not as many as the 1970s. So the key questions you're going to get asked about Thatcher and monetarism is, was it a revolution? And there are obviously for and against arguments for that. Did it work? Likewise, did it help her win the 1983 election? I would probably say no on that one, although there were signs of recovery in the economy. Historical interpretation then. Gilmore, Conservative wet, accused Thatcher of steering the ship of state straight onto the rocks. That was when he left the government. Norman Tebbit, a very staunch supporter of Thatcher, compared the layabouts, compared his father to the layabouts in the 1980s, and he said about his father, he didn't riot, he got on his bike and looked for work, and then went on looking until he found it. Reginald Maudlin, the ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer, described monetarism as this crazy, if coherent, vision. Dennis Kavanagh, a very critical historian of Thatcher, said that she did succeed in imposing monetarism on the UK. Jim Pryor, the Conservative politician, agrees, but Peter Riddell argues that she did not succeed in imposing it. Chris Rowe says Mrs. Thatcher made it plain that she was a conviction politician, determined to take a radical approach to the economy. Rowe also says the government slackened its monetarist policies in 1982 and 83. Rowe says many historians, both those who admired Thatcher and those who hated everything she stood for, remain convinced that 1979 was a landmark year, marking the end of consensus and Butzkellism. Michael Lynch says her intention was nothing less than to change the economic basis on which Britain was run. He also says Tebbit's support for Thatcher helped her make her mind up not to let the riots deflect her from her monetarist policies. Lynch says the U-turn speech was a calculated act of defiance against the Wets. Patrick Walter Atkins says there are at least 7 major areas where there was significant change in the economy or the way that it was managed. He also says the early budgets of her administration were dominated by the wish to lower inflation. Patrick Walsh Atkins also says the days of high inflation have been ended. Economists debate whether Thatcher's monetarism was in any way responsible. Some argue that the price drop in oil from the mid-1980s was as important. Walsh Atkins also says recession and unemployment helped keep wages down, and imposing tight spending controls on local government also helped. Selden and Collins say whatever the economic consequences during her first year, Mrs. Thatcher demonstrated her personal hegemony and that of her ideas in economic policy. Selden and Collins also say the 1981 budget was a successful demonstration of Mrs. Thatcher's resolve to do what she believed in, and not buckle under pressure. Derek Murphy says, although many of the monetarist policies were quietly abandoned before 1983, the effects of the recession lingered. Britain since has been kept in the black by the service sector, especially the financial services in London, and not the industrial sector. John O'Farrell says the top rate of tax remained at 60% under Thatcher for most of her term, and that's way above the 40% paid by the very rich under Blair, so Thatcher taxed them more. O'Farrell says the mistake the Wets made is that they argued against the risks of high unemployment as if it were a bad thing. Thatcher realised that it would cut inflation by reducing demand. And finally, Andrew Marr says monetarism originated in the 1950s, but only became really fashionable by the mid-1970s, after the barber boom let inflation get wildly out of control, and huge inflation followed. That's it for this one. See you next time with Thatcher and her economic policies after 1983.